Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Hanford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HanfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HanfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HanfordCapital.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Sunday edition of the Tough Decisions podcast. This is Dennae. We are talking about the book titled Blink by Marshall Goldsmith, Thinking Without Thinking. And what we've been discussing the last several Sundays is the way that our adaptive unconscious works. So today we're going to look at some applications, I think, and hopefully start to get into some of the situations where we can trust our thin slicing and some situations where the thin slicing that is done cannot be trusted. And that's really where we get into what can be valuable for us, because we want to know when we can trust that, quote, gut instinct, and when maybe that gut instinct or that gut feeling should be second-guessed or thought further about. In Chapter 5, Goldsmith dives into the area of quantifying people's preferences, their valuations, their first impressions, and the way that he does this is by talking about market research that's done. Now, quantifying people's preferences or their opinions, their impressions, this is a pretty difficult task. And what he does is he tries to demonstrate some of the errors or the misjudgments or even the downright bad decisions that have been made by simply asking people what they want and then basing a decision on that. The problems that come out of making decisions based on surveying people's opinions is that really people don't know what they want. And when he first made that statement in that type of language, I was a little bit skeptical because why can't you just ask people what they like and trust the answer? But the problem comes out of a lot of times people, they don't have the vocabulary to state what they want, or they don't have the vocabulary to state their actual true opinion. And so, especially when you give them just a couple of choices, they may be forced into a decision, but the decision that they would verbalize would not be the actual decision that they'd make in real life. So I know that sounds a little confusing, and I probably made it a little bit more confusing than it needs to be, but I hope to clarify that by giving you some of the examples that Goldsmith gives in his book. So I want to start with mentioning a musician that Goldsmith talks about, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm not a rock musician expert, but he talks about a musician named Kenna. The title is actually Kenna's Dilemma. And the issue that he raises with this musician named Kenna was that Kenna was sort of a avant-garde musician, and his music didn't fit neatly into one specific category. But all of the experts loved him. So anytime he would play in front of anybody who was anyone in the industry, he was just loved and embraced, and his music was, they loved what he wrote and how he performed. But for some reason, Kenna, for the longest time, didn't really catch on with the public. And so even now, he, as a musician, is compared to other groups and other musicians, he's relatively unknown. They never could get any hard evidence that the public would like him. So therefore, he was never played frequently on, for instance, radio stations. And so the dilemma was, why was he so accepted and so welcomed by experts, but when they played him for people to say, yes, I like him, or no, I don't, he never got good ratings. And some of the situations where they would do that would be, for example, they have groups or people that participate in survey groups, and, you know, the market research done by the music industry would give people a call and then play a new musician's song over the phone for them and then have them rate that song. Did you like it? How likely would you be to listen to it again? Would you like to hear this on the radio? Those kinds of questions. And in that situation, Kenna never got a good rating. And it was always kind of a puzzling thing because he never scored well in those types of research situations, but the experts always loved him. So I want to kind of leave that there and we'll come back to it because that was a bit of a dilemma. Do we play him on the radio station? Every time we play him for an audience, he never gets good scores. But yet the experts are saying, play him. We like his music. He's good. And so I want to leave that there with that dilemma, and we'll come back to that as we approach the end of today's podcast. Now, going back to our original thought at the beginning, it's not always possible to evaluate how good or bad something is just by asking people, because their reason behind why they answer the way they do is not always explainable. Okay? An example from something that we've already talked about. Remember on the first podcast on this book, we talked about the situation where the Iowa gamblers were given the 4 card decks, 2 red and 2 blue. And long before they could explain what was going on with those card decks, they were shying away from the red decks. Remember that the red decks had the big winners and the big losers, where the blue decks had much smaller gains, but they also had much smaller loser cards, if you will. So long before those gamblers could actually put words to their reasons, they had already, in essence, figured out what was going on, but they didn't even know it. So they were shying away from the red cards, but they couldn't explain it until they had drawn up to 80 cards. Then there was also John Gottman, who did the research on the couples. And remember, he was the one who would have them come into his office and he would put them up on the platform and he would record and watch closely their interactions. What we didn't spend a lot of time talking about is that many times before he watched their interactions, he would ask them to rate themselves in certain areas. But what he found is that that rating that they gave themselves was not a very good predictor as to their longevity. What was a much better predictor of their longevity was their interactions that he could observe and record and rewatch. The point being, what they verbalized was not actually the case. And he could only figure out exactly the truth by watching them. So what we say is not really what is always going on. The answers that people verbalize are not always reliable. An example of this, and this I think will be something that you will be able to sort of visualize, is the age-old Pepsi versus Coke debate. Now, in the 1980s, Pepsi began to gain a fairly significant market share on Coke, and it was in large part due to their claim that they beat Coke in a taste test. What they had done is they had gone out and they had, blind taste tested Pepsi versus Coke. And they said, well, every time that a consumer tastes our Pepsi versus, their Coke recipe, Pepsi wins out. At first, Coke's strategy was to dispute these claims. And they'd say, no, it's not true. Or, talk about how Pepsi must have done something to rig the test. But then they ran their own taste tests and they found that actually people did indeed prefer the taste of Pepsi. And so Coke became concerned. Even some of their top executives said, we have to take a look at our recipe because Pepsi's right. People are choosing Pepsi over Coke. What's going on here? So they did. They actually went back and they did some research. They changed their recipe and they tried to come out with this new Coke and take back the market share. And it failed miserably. Eventually, they had to return to the classic Coke recipe. So the question then becomes is, why, if Pepsi was winning in all the taste tests, were people still buying Coke? And the end of the story is Coke and Pepsi pretty much have remained at that market share, with Coke having more than Pepsi. Pepsi gained a little bit, but not what Coke was worried about. Not enough to make them go back and change their recipe, which obviously they had done all the work and spent all the money, which it wasn't warranted. They got a little nervous and they did that, but in the end, it wasn't needed, because Coke retained their large portion of the market share. So why was that? If people were actually preferring Pepsi, why did they not switch and buy Pepsi? why were these tests not a valid measurement of the way the people actually really feel or the way people would actually decide when they were given a choice? Why did Pepsi not take over the market based on these tests? Well, there's a couple of things to think about. And those who are involved in market research, you may already be ahead of me. There is the sip test versus drinking the whole can. So when they were doing this test, they were only giving people basically a sip or a drink. Take a drink of this cup, take a drink of that cup, tell me which one you prefer. Well, in a sip test, Pepsi was winning, but the question is, if you had to drink the whole can, would you still feel the same way? Would you still like Pepsi over Coke if you had a whole can? I think, based on the actual events, we can say that probably not. Most people, it appears, prefer Coke when they have to drink the whole can or they get to drink the whole can. Relating this back to our Kenna dilemma, when that market research was done and they just called those people and played one song for them, was that an accurate way to determine how good Kenna was versus maybe sending them an entire album? What if they had sent those people an entire album and had them rate? Would the results have been different? I don't know, but it's quite possible. Another thing to think about is an idea called sensation transference. This was first studied by a man named Louis Cheskin, and he argued that on the unconscious level, the mind doesn't distinguish between the package and the product. So, in other words, the product is equal to the packaging and the product combined, stating essentially that the way the product appears and is packaged together affects the taste or the quality, or better stated, affects the perception of the taste or the quality. So when we go to the grocery store and pick up something, we don't pick it up just because we like the taste or just because we like the quality, but rather the packaging also has a lot to do with our opinion on the quality. So that's sensation transference. That comes through in our Pepsi versus Coke because for so long, Coke had been the prominent drink. And so when given a choice on the shelf between the actual Pepsi and its packaging and the Coke and its packaging, people would choose Coke most of the time. What happened in the sip test is that they didn't have the packaging to go on. And he argues that it actually affects the taste. And our perception of the package affects the way that the item tastes in our mouth. So when we don't have that package, then maybe Pepsi does taste better. But when you add in the packaging and the way the product is presented, then Coke tastes better. So the principle that we need to pull out of this is that thin slicing has to be done in the proper context. Again, going back to Gottman's predictions about the longevity of those married couples, those were only valid when he observed a conversation about something of relevance to their relationship. In other words, he couldn't just drop into their vehicle and listen to them discussing where they were going to eat dinner that night and make those predictions. It had to be something of relevance to both of them, something that they both felt strongly about for him to observe and actually make his predictions. In the same way, the market research has to be done in the right context in order for the results to be reliable. A second product that I want to talk about, and this is probably a little less well known than Pepsi versus Coke, but it's about an office chair called the Aeron. Now, the Aeron was developed by a company owned by Herman Miller, and he had this vision for a completely new, unlike anything that had ever been used before, office chair. And his goal was to make it the most ergonomically beneficial chair to hit the market. The problem was it was going to look completely different from any other office chair up to that point. And it had to be different in order to achieve the ergonomic effects that Miller and his company wanted. And without going into a lot of detail about those differences, when I think office chair, I think big, president of the company, CEO, large back, padded, huge chair. The Aeron was completely opposite of that. It was scaled down. It was minimalist, if you will. Before minimalist was a thing, this was minimalist. It was kind of wiry looking. It had a smaller back. And so it looked completely different from everything that most people envisioned when you say the word executive chair. And when they had it market tested, it failed miserably Basically, no one liked it, and everyone thought it was too expensive and too ugly to ever be used in an office setting. But Miller went ahead anyway. He said, I really believe in this product, and we're going to send it to market. And they had spent, at that point, months developing it and doing research to try to make sure they had the best chair possible. And then no one liked it, and Miller, to his credit, went against that and said, no, we're going to bring it to market anyway. The end of the story is that eventually the chair caught on, and it actually became the most successful product that this company had created up to that point. So the question is, what happened? If people hated it so much, then why, when it came to market and people actually started using it, why did it eventually catch on if it was really that bad? The answer is, it's not that they didn't like it, it was that it was different. They said it was ugly, but they actually misinterpreted their own feelings. And what they meant was it was so different and unusual that they weren't used to it. And market tests like this are done on people that have no history with the product. And it's even harder for them to envision themselves with the product into the future. So what they perceive as ugly is really, in this case, just different. The question becomes, is that always the case? Well, no. You can go back and look at Ford has made some new car products, and they were just ugly and they never caught on. But in this particular case, the ugly wasn't that it was really ugly, it was just different. And people had no history with the product. They couldn't see it. They couldn't imagine it into the future. And so it was just determined that, oh, it's ugly, it's not going to be used. And again, to Herman Miller's credit, he kind of saw through that and felt like if we could just get it into the market and just get a few people using it, then I think that its value is going to be seen. And of course, he was right. The new and the different is always going to be vulnerable in market research. And again, that's not to say that everything that's called ugly is just because you don't see its value and it's eventually going to catch on. That's not true. But this is a situation where we have to step back and go, okay, maybe this is a place where we can't trust that initial first impression and do further research or further looking into the situation. Lastly, I want to talk about something that Goldsmith calls the gift of expertise. And he concludes this chapter by drawing a distinction between the first impressions of experts versus the inexperienced. So experts are able to more reliably account for their reactions and their first impressions because of their experience in their education. And their experience within a certain field allows them to have a vocabulary to discern and label their reactions. So applying that to the situation with the chair, assuming there could be someone that was an expert on seating or office seating even, they might have been able to test that chair out and they might have had the vocabulary and the experience to discern what they were feeling as being different rather than ugly. Whereas the inexperienced, the average person is just going to look at that and go, oh, that's ugly, I don't want that. An expert would be able to discern that. A good example of this is in the area of food tasting, and this is the area that Goldsmith dives into just a little bit to illustrate his point. But food tasting experts have years of education and actual tasting, and they learn to describe everything about a product: appearance, texture, flavor, and they have different dimensions of each of these, and they have a scale for each dimension. Example, in the area of texture, there's dimensions like adhesiveness to lips, firmness, denseness, slipperiness. And on each one of those dimensions, there's a 1 to 15 scale. So it can be slippery on a 1 to 15, denseness 1 to 15, firmness 1 to 15. And so there's all these specific areas that those food tasting experts have learned to discern just by years and years of practice and experience. So when they taste a new product, or they taste an old product that's been reworked and has a new recipe, such as Coke, then they have a whole range of areas to pull from and terms to describe that new product that the average person doesn't have. And even more so, they have the experience to actually discern those in the product. So he does want us to see that, the first impressions of experts can be different from the inexperienced. But as a whole, the market research is interested in the opinions of your average people. So then we're faced with making sure that market research, questions, predictions, those are all pulled from situations that are done in the right context. So to conclude here, what we've learned about thin slicing is that thin slicing has to be done in the proper context, and it has to be done by people who are qualified to make those kinds of judgments. Otherwise, outside of that, thin slicing can be a very slippery slope, and it can cause us to waste time, cause us to waste energy, money, following opinions and ideas that really are not valid or reliable. However, when done in the proper context, then thin slicing can give us very valuable information that can guide our decisions into the future. So that concludes our discussion today of Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And next week, we're going to go a little bit further into the thin slicing and talk about something that probably all of us have wanted to do at some point or another, and that is mind reading. But we're going to look at when mind reading is a good thing and when mind reading may not be able to be trusted because of the situations that we're in. So join me next week. We'll talk about thin slicing people, or mind reading as Gladwell calls it, and hopefully have a good discussion and learn some things about thin slicing in those situations as well.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email, where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.